How do you reduce the probability of cyber incidents? Hi, I'm Jimmy Dane with Curiosity, your hopeful cybersecurity guide. Today in this video, I'm going to share with you my thought process on how to identify vulnerabilities through a threat-driven, risk-based approach so that you can 1. Reduce the probability of cyber incidents, and 2. Minimize the impact to your organization in the event of a cyber incident so that you can enable your organization to meet its business objectives. So let's get started. There are 9 boxes here. I'm going to explain to you what they are, starting with this first box, and then we're going to end up with this one. With any cybersecurity framework or risk management framework that we're using, the first thing first is that we need to identify the asset that we want to protect, because we can't protect what we don't know. Similarly, we can't manage what we can't measure. So first thing first is asset identification. Asset is information or information systems within your organization. I'm going to place a placeholder here for us to come back and elaborate on more. From a threat perspective, we want to know, excuse me, I'm about to sneeze. Sorry. From a threat perspective, we want to know what are the threats that we are dealing with and where are these threats originating from. This is known as threat source. Think of threats as potential dangers to our organization. An organization confronts with so many different threats, such as natural disasters like fire and flood. But for cyber threats, for this video, we're going to focus on human-made threats. There are 2 types of human-made threats. The first is external. The second is internal. Within these threat sources, there are 2 categories. The first is authorized. The second is unauthorized. Let me give you an example of an unauthorized internal threat. For instance, we have an employee who had already transitioned to a different role and no longer required access to the assets, but still retained access and continue to accumulate additional permissions. Next, let's understand who and what is posing a threat to our assets. This is known as threat adversaries. Think of threat adversaries as the bad guys who want to gain unauthorized access to the assets and cause harm to our organization. There are different types of threat adversaries, such as hacktivists and etc., as we see here on the screen. In this video, we'll focus on 3 external and 2 internal threat adversaries that will pose the biggest risk to our organization. First, let's take a look at developers. They may not pose direct threats to an organization as they develop malicious software, also known as malware, and offer as a service to enable other hackers to carry out the attacks. Next, hackers. Here we're specifically talking about black hat hackers. These are individuals or groups of cyber criminals who can cause harm to our organization by compromising our digital devices and networks through unauthorized access to an account or a computer system. And finally, nation-state actors. They are supported and sponsored by their government to accomplish various objectives, which we'll cover later on. Next, we have internal adversaries, also known as insider threats. There are 2 types of insider threats. The first is intentional. Intentional threats are malicious actions performed by hostile insiders with the intent of causing harm to our organization. The other is unintentional. Unintentional threats are non-malicious. They are either accidental or inadvertent actions that can cause unintended harm to our organization. I'm adding an asterisk here as a reminder to elaborate later on. We want to understand our adversaries further. First, we want to understand their motivations or motives or intents. What are they motivated by? In general, the three adversaries we're focusing on are typically motivated by geopolitical, profit, and discontent. We can group their motivations into three areas: FPP, financial, political, and personal gains. Yes, another acronym here. Let's understand each threat adversary's motives. Developers are mostly motivated by financial. For example, the dark side developer group that's linked to the Colonial Pipeline's ransomware hacking was motivated by financial gains. As shown here in this article, in addition to making money through hacking activities, such as the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in 2021, the group develops ransomware tools and offers as a service to enable other hackers to carry out the attacks. Next up, hackers. They are motivated by financial and or personal gains. Let's examine the Lapsus group as an example. This is an organized cybercriminal gang consisted of teenagers who breached tech companies such as Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Samsung. The teen from Oxford was accused of being the leader and alleged to have amassed about $14 million. As stated in this article, the group wrote that its goal was money, not political reasons. However, other researchers believed the group was also motivated by notoriety or hacker clout. Finally, nation state. Unlike developers and hackers who are typically motivated by financial and personal gains, nation state adversaries are typically motivated by nationalism and political gains. They usually aim for high-profile public and private figures and entities, such as the government, with the intent of stealing intellectual property, disrupting service to critical infrastructure, and or conducting massive scale of misinformation and disinformation. Case in point, in the 2020 SolarWinds attack with the Cozy Bear group. As shown in this article, Cozy Bear is a Russia-backed hacker group that leveraged SolarWinds software and tools to install malware in organizations around the world, including the US Departments of Treasury, Commerce, and Homeland Security departments. The security breach allowed access to email and other sensitive resources. Next up, it's intentional insider threats. This is what we call EFW, another acronym, enemies from within. These hostile, malicious insiders are difficult to detect and defend. They maliciously and intentionally abuse legitimate credentials to steal information or disrupt services for financial or personal incentives. For instance, a former Twitter employee received at least $300,000 from Saudi Arabia in exchange for confidential Twitter personal account information of users who use anonymous handles to criticize the kingdom and its royal family. This individual was motivated by financial gains. Here's a case where an individual was driven by personal gains. A former San Francisco City's network engineer employee intentionally denied administrators access to the city's computer system for 12 days. He was motivated by the fear of possible layoff and the discovery that he lied about his criminal background when applied for the job. Additionally, he hijacked the systems to prove a point that the city was too lax about security. We now understand about our threat adversaries' motivations. Another characteristic that we want to understand about our threat adversaries is their capabilities. Capability is defined as the power or ability to do something. Capability consists of several factors, including, but not limited to, knowledge, skills, and resources. Knowledge. What do the threat adversaries know about our organization, our employees, and our vulnerabilities? Skills. What skills do they possess? And resources. What support and resources do they have that would enable them to carry out attacks and cause harm to an organization? As shown here, the capabilities and means, the resources, increase as we move up from insider to state-sponsored threat adversaries. We now know the threat sources, our threat adversaries, and their motivations and capabilities. Next, we want to know the likelihood of the threat adversaries carrying out an attack. This likelihood or probability is called threat level. One of the ways to assess and determine the threat level is through threat intelligence or threat intel. Threat intel is data that has been collected and contextualized to understand the threat adversary's motives, targets, and attack behaviors, as well as to evaluate the threat source and reliability. So where do we get threat intel? There are commercial and open source threat intel platforms and services. An example of a free threat intel service is through CISA. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under the Department of Homeland Security. CISA offers AIST, also known as Automated Indicator Sharing. AIST shares threat activity contexts such as tactics, techniques, procedures, vulnerabilities, and courses of actions with the AIST community through the open standards, STIX and TAXI. STIX stands for Structured Threat Information Expression. It contextualizes cyber threat indicators and defensive measures information, while TAXI, Trusted Automated Exchange of Indicators information, allows the machine-to-machine communications. Think of STIX as what is the information, and TAXI, it's how to share the information. Another service that CISA offers is CISCP, Cyber Information Sharing and Collaboration Program. This is an analyst-to-analyst sharing of threat and vulnerability information service. Membership for IAST and CISCP is free. An open source threat intel sharing platform that is worth exploring, it's MISP, Malware Information Sharing and Threat Intelligence Sharing Platform. The software is free to use. Data format and API are completely open standards and supported by the community and professional services. Another two sources are logs and people. Logs contain valuable information that can help us discover and assess potential threats. People in our organization or in our network can provide threat intel, especially our engineers and frontline team members. We now know our threat sources, our threat adversaries, their motivations and capabilities, and the threat level. What we want to know next are the vulnerabilities that our threat adversaries will likely to exploit to compromise our assets. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses with PPT, people, process, and technology that can potentially be exploited by our threat adversaries to cause harm to our organization. We elaborate further on vulnerability as it's a key topic of this knowledge sharing session. Next, we want to know the methods or pathways in which our threat adversaries will likely to exploit the vulnerabilities. This is called attack vector. In order to protect, detect, and defend our assets, we need to think like our adversaries and anticipate their moves. We can use the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's a globally accessible knowledge database of adversary tactics, techniques, and based on real-world observations. For example, this is the attack matrix for enterprise. We can see the techniques our adversary may leverage to carry out an attack. The adversary may fish for information in the reconnaissance pillar and then compromise accounts in the resource development pillar, and then conduct phishing in the initial access pillar and move down to the exfiltration pillar. Another helpful resource is the Lockheed Martin Cyber Kill Chain. This framework explains how threat adversaries can move through the networks to identify vulnerabilities that they can then exploit. The framework is divided into 7 stages, starting with the reconnaissance. This stage involves researching potential targets to gain knowledge, such as finding known vulnerabilities, exploring existing entry points, and etc., followed by weaponization all the way through the actions and objectives phase. We now have some ideas on how our threat adversaries may carry out attacks. The next question is, where will they attack? This is known as attack surface. Attack surface are all possible points of access that are susceptible to attacks that our threat adversaries could use to gain foothold into our organization's network. Given our finite resources, we need to be strategic and judicious in how we use our resources to protect our assets. From a risk-based standpoint, we need to prioritize the assets that need protection and reduce the attack surface. We do this by classifying and categorizing assets based on information and information systems, sensitivity, and criticality. Classifying and categorizing is not only important for prioritization, but also a vital part of data lifecycle management. It can help ensure an organization adheres to its own data handling guidelines and complies with local, state, and federal regulation requirements as well. Here is an example of the military data classification label. Looking at the chart from a risk perspective, we would want to invest our resources to provide heightened focus and protection, starting with the top secret first, then secret, and then confidential. Here's an example of a private data classification. The classification may differ from one organization to the next based on business requirements. Another element to aid with prioritization is the CIA triad. It's a security model that is built around the principles of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, and it's designed to guide an organization to establish information programs, security development, security infrastructure, including the support of data classification and data security that we talked about. At a high level, confidentiality is about keeping the data private, secret, and secure. Only authorized users and processes should be able to access or modify data. Next, integrity. It's about keeping data consistent, accurate, and reliable, as well as ensuring data is guarded against improper information modification or destruction, either accidentally or maliciously. And finally, availability. It's about ensuring information and information systems are available and accessible. After completing the prioritization exercise, the assets that we need to protect should be effectively reduced along with the attack surface. Instead of protecting all the assets, we would only need to allocate resources protecting the subset of assets that are of high value and critical. Next, we want to figure out the impact to our organization if the assets were to be compromised or disrupted. Think of impact as the magnitude of potential loss to an organization. To assist with the impact assessment, we can use the Business Impact Analysis, also known as BIA. According to NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, BIA is the second step of the 7-step contingency planning process. It helps identify and prioritize critical IT systems and components to assess the consequences and impacts of a disruption to a business. That's right, disruptions to the business, not just IT, because cyber risk is business risk. It can impact an organization strategically, financially, and etc. When we talk about risk, think of risk as potential loss or opportunity to an organization. The way to calculate risk is by taking the probability of an event occurring and multiplied by impact.
But how do we calculate cyber risk? We will multiply threat and vulnerability and divide by probability and impact. Continuing with risk, every asset has potential inherent risk. This is the amount of risk exists in the absence of any security controls. How do we address risk? There are 4 common risk treatment options: accept, avoid, mitigate, and transfer. Starting with the bottom left, accept, retain risk without doing anything about it, and then moving to the top, transfer or share risk to another party, such as cyber insurance company. And to the right, avoid, stop performing certain tasks or processes if risks are too significant to mitigate with any other options. And finally, the bottom right, mitigate or reduce risk by implementing controls. Choosing a risk treatment option is influenced by many factors, such as costs and benefits, maturity of an organization, and etc. That said, risk mitigation is the most common risk treatment option. To mitigate risk, we implement 3 types of security controls. First is the physical controls. Second, technical or logical controls. And finally, administrative or management controls. Let's define what these controls are. Physical controls protect resources and infrastructure from physical threats. Technical controls. We leverage technology to prevent unauthorized access to our systems and data. Controls at this level act as another line of defense if an unauthorized user were to gain access to our information or information systems. And finally, administrative controls. This is where we ensure that human error does not create security vulnerabilities, such as enforcing policies, procedures, and guidelines. There are also 3 control functions, starting with preventive or preventative. Preventive controls are security mechanisms, tools, and/or practices that can prevent the probability of an information security incident from occurring. These controls allow for proactive approach and build a security-first culture. Let's see how the control functions and the security controls work together. For example, for physical controls, we would use locks to prevent people from entering server room or ID badge to get into the building. For technical controls, we would implement firewall to block malicious IPs, patching, hardening, access controls, and encryption. And then for administrative controls, we would implement hiring policies such as background checks and data classification. Even with best intentions and efforts, preventing every cyber risk from occurring is infeasible and impractical. And that leads us to residual risk. These are threats and vulnerabilities that remain after risk treatment and remediation efforts have been implemented. In other words, a portion of risk remaining after security measures have been applied because it could be that technically it is infeasible or impractical to implement preventive controls. In this case, implementing potential temporary alternatives or compensating controls to address any residual risk is needed. Another control function is detective controls. They are after the fact. They are designed to identify anomalies or malicious activities and alert on these activities for visibility. They can also help to determine whether existing preventive controls are working as intended. Examples of detective controls include, for physical controls, we use surveillance cameras. For technical controls, we implement intrusion detection systems, logs. And for administrative controls, we review access rights on a regular cadence. And finally, the last control function is the corrective controls. These controls come into play after an information security incident or a problem has been detected. They remedy flaws, make improvements, and guide corrective actions. Examples of corrective controls are, for physical controls, reissuing access cards. For technical controls, update vulnerability patching program. And finally, for administrative controls, implement a business continuity and disaster recovery plan if one is not available. Let's turn our focus to insider threats for a moment. According to Statista and Gartner, forecasted spending for information security related was around $150 billion in 2021, mostly in technologies, as shown here in this chart. I would imagine this number is a lot higher in 2022. With this staggering amount of money spent on information security, the question is, why are there still so many security incidents occurring? According to Code 42, a cybersecurity software company specializing in insider risk management reported that 60% of data breaches originated from employees, while Verizon reported 82% of breaches involved human element. This means that there is opportunity to allocate investments and resources into reducing human risk, such as providing more robust security awareness training, as well as providing secure coding training for engineers and developers. Software vulnerabilities aren't the problem. Software vulnerabilities are just the symptoms of the problem. The focus should be on addressing root causes rather than the symptoms. This is a great segue into vulnerability. One of the ways to identify vulnerabilities is through DevSecOps, short for Development, Security, and Operations. It's the concept of shifting security left. It's a development practice and process that integrates security initiatives at every stage of the software development lifecycle to deliver robust and security applications. In application security, this means introducing security earlier into the software development lifecycle. It also expands the collaboration between development and operation teams to integrate security. A few tools and practices that support and ensure code is free from coding errors and safeguard against software security vulnerabilities include SAST, Static Application Security Testing. It often refers to as the white box testing approach, which analyzes the application from the inside. Adding SAST to the CI/CD pipeline automated tools enables scanning and analyzing application source code, binaries, code flaws, while the application is inactive to find security weaknesses or vulnerabilities, such as OWASP top 10 before releasing the application to production. In my experience, SAST contains high level of false positives. So it's important to take this into consideration before blocking the code from moving into the next development lifecycle, because this will have real material negative impact on the development experience and development velocity. Next, DAST, Dynamic Application Security Testing, also known as the black box testing approach. It's testing from the outside with no knowledge of the application. It simulates external attacks on a live application, checking for vulnerabilities. DAST does not access source code or find vulnerabilities in source code like SAST. It usually runs toward the end of the development lifecycle. The way that it works is during runtime, DAST mimics adversarial behaviors, analyzes the whole application as it runs. The scanner crawls through pages and finds all potential inputs. After it completes, it begins attacking the various endpoints in a variety of ways, as we touched earlier on MITRE ATT&CK. It would try several attack vectors to find different vulnerabilities. Once complete, it provides a detailed report for each vulnerable URL. A typical report will include details on successful attacks and potential solutions to fix the issue. Next, IAST, Interactive Application Security Testing, which is a hybrid approach. It's also known as a gray box testing. IAST is designed to address the shortcomings of SAST and DAST by combining elements of both approaches. The way that it works is that IAST places an agent within an application and performs all its analysis in the application in real time and anywhere in the development processes. It doesn't need additional scans as it continuously monitors applications and detects vulnerabilities in real time in the background while functional testing occurs. Next up is RASP, Runtime Application Self-Protection. It's designed to detect attacks against an application in real time. It relies on both real-time attack detection capability and application behavior awareness. Once an application is running, RASP can protect it from malicious input or behavior by analyzing the application's behavior and the context of that behavior. By using the application to monitor its behavior constantly, attacks can be instantly identified and mitigated without human intervention. When a security event occurs in an application, RASP takes control of the application and fixes the problem. For examples, it can prevent the execution of instructions to the database, which looks like SQL injection attack, or terminate an end user's session from malicious IP address. Next, threat modeling is the process of visualizing and identifying vulnerabilities in software from the design phase through the software development lifecycle. It requires building flow diagrams with trust boundaries between assets, threats, and controls, plotting security gaps, and mapping them back to risks and capabilities. The ideal time to perform threat modeling is in the earliest stages of the software development lifecycle during the architectural phase of application development. It allows software architects to identify and mitigate potential security issues early. The ultimate purpose of threat modeling is to anticipate and proactively address how an attacker might compromise an application. Any threat model built during this early stage should then be used to inform all downstream security activities, including implementation, testing, and beyond. While SAST, DAST, and IAST security testing tools are used in the development process to identify vulnerabilities, the tools do not catch everything, especially complicated or new vulnerabilities. This is where bug bounty programs can augment security testing and add value to the DevSecOps process. A bug bounty program is a way to add another layer of diligence to our security program, such as annual penetration testing requirements, and to continuously assess our external web and mobile application portfolio with manual independent security researchers. In my experience, it's important to work with the bug bounties program manager to create ongoing campaigns to one, attract top talent to test our applications, and two, ensure that active testing activities are happening. Otherwise, the return on investment on the annual subscription may not match our expectations. Next, red-blue teaming exercises can help identify vulnerabilities and strengthen our security operations. Establishing red, blue, and purple teams may not be practical or feasible, depending on an organization's maturity level, resources, and skills. Red team. Red team performs ethical hacking by emulating an advanced threat adversary using the tools and techniques of likely attackers in the most realistic way possible, and circumventing established defensive controls and identifying gaps in the organization's cyber defense strategy to better understand how an organization detects and responds to real-world attacks. The results from a red teaming exercise help identify needed improvements in security controls. Blue team. The blue team defends against both real-world attacks and red team's activities. Blue teams are considered as the proactive defenders. They usually have slightly different responsibilities than the standard security operations center, known as a SOC analyst. They provide constant and continuous cyber defense against all forms of cyber attacks. And finally, purple team. Its objective is to align red and blue teams' activities and leverage the insights and the results to prioritize vulnerabilities to an organization. Penetration testing, or pen test, is a common testing approach used to detect vulnerabilities across organizations' infrastructures and network. The objective of pen testing is to harden and improve security by discovering exploitable vulnerabilities in the security defenses. It's a point-in-time security assessment of the networks, applications, or endpoint devices' security posture. Pen test results include an output of a report with an executive summary, scope of work, methodology, summary of findings, recommendations, post-test remediation, and finding details. Along the line of pen tests, any other third-party audit results, including but not limited to the SOC 2 Type 2, also known as a Service Organization Controls Report, could provide insight into vulnerability findings. Next, BAST. Breach and attack simulation tools are designed to determine if security controls detect and respond to attacks as they should. The way that BAST works is that it does this by simulating attack scenarios and providing analysis of how controls performed. It enables our organization to see its overall security posture from an attacker's perspective and to proactively predict attacks, validate security controls, and improve response efforts. BAST remains a newer IT security technology, but its capabilities are increasingly essential and becoming an important component of an organization's security strategy. Traditional testing approaches like vulnerability assessment, penetration testing, and red team, blue teaming, as we talked about earlier, becoming less effective given that companies are moving to a more dynamic cloud-based IT architecture with an increasing diversity of endpoints and applications. Speaking of the cloud security presents different challenges compared to the risk of previous computing models. The cloud infrastructure is often highly complex, which makes it difficult to, 1, maintain visibility and control, 2, meet compliance requirements, and 3, identify and mitigate risk, and not to mention the added challenges of implementing and maintaining security controls and security configurations for the infrastructure. To combat these challenges, CSPM, also known as Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM solutions automatically and continuously scan and analyze cloud services. It checks for security misconfiguration that can lead to data breaches, such as having an open S3 bucket. It checks for excessive access permissions and also any exposed APIs and weak authentications. And finally, threat hunting, also known as cyber threat hunting, is a proactive approach to identifying previously unknown or ongoing non-remediated threats within our organization's network. Threat hunting is an aggressive tactic that operates from the premise of the assumption of the breach, meaning that attackers are already inside our organization's network for weeks or for months on end, and they are covertly monitoring, preparing, and executing attacks without any automated defense detecting their presence. Threat hunting stops these attacks by seeking out covert indicators of compromise so they can be mitigated before any attacks achieve their objectives. A successful threat hunting program requires 1, highly skilled IT security professionals, 2, established security incident and event management systems, a robust data collection process, and finally, security analytics tools in place. Depending on an organization's maturity level, it's not feasible to have a threat hunting program. Therefore, outsourcing these activities to a third party such as an MDR, managed detection and response provider, would make sense. MDR is a service that continuously monitors, prioritizes, and responds to cybersecurity threats with dedicated, highly skilled security analysts assigned to an organization. MDR allows for investigation by hands-on, expert skilled in threat hunting and incident management who can deliver actionable outcomes. The actions can range from gathering relevant logs and data to contextualizing information and prioritizing threats and to analyzing, investigating, and responding to cybersecurity incidents. Okay, now that we have gone through the process of identifying cyber risk in our organization, where do we go from here? We need to have a risk register or risk ledger. The risk register provides insights into risk management and risk analysis activities in our organization. The risk register should include information such as detailed description of the risk being identified, the analysis that we conducted to measure and understand the impact to our organization, detailed risk mitigation strategies and plan, detailed strategy and plan on tracking and monitoring the risk, and finally, a detailed risk reporting plan. Risk reporting is important, particularly when reporting to our organization's executives and board of directors for their awareness, prioritization, and budget approval. Risk reporting becomes critically important for public companies because the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, now requires public companies to report on any material cybersecurity incidents, as well as the board of directors have oversight of the cybersecurity risk in an organization. This is an example of a risk register. A final comment about the risk register is that it's not only a business record reflecting the history and findings from risk assessments. The lack of a risk register would indicate that our organization may be a compliance-based, or worse yet, an asset-based or ad hoc. These approaches are signs of lower maturity where our organization's security posture is mainly reactive and do little planning. To close out, I'd like to leave you with some resources to deepen your understanding on topics we covered in this video. The first source is the NIST-CSF, also known as the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The framework integrates standards and best practices to guide and enable organizations to understand their cybersecurity risk, reduce the risk with customized measures, and respond and recover from cybersecurity incidents. Followed by the NIST Special Publication 837, which provides guidelines for applying the risk management framework to federal information systems to include performing security categorization, selecting and implementing security controls, completing security controls assessments, getting information security authorization, and implementing security continuous monitoring. Next, along with this, it's the NIST Special Publication 839, Managing Information Security Risk, is the governance for an organization-wide program. It uses a three-tiered approach, starting with the top level one, organization tier, establishing of a top-level risk responsibility and risk management strategy. Next level down is level two, the mission and business process tier. It's about separating the critical processes and having redundancy of critical processes for business resiliency purposes. And finally, level three, the information systems tier, is to ensure risk assessment and adequate security controls are applied at the beginning of information system lifecycle. Speaking of security controls, NIST Special Publication 853, Security and Privacy Controls for Information Systems and Organizations. It provides a catalog of 20 security and privacy control families, as shown here on the screen, that are required for all U.S. federal information systems. And finally, the 853A and 853B. Let's start with the 853A, Assessing Security and Privacy Controls. It provides a methodology and a set of procedures for conducting assessments. and the 853B Control Baseline of Information Systems and Organizations. It provides guidance on 3 security control baselines for low, moderate, and high impact for federal systems. Next, the CIS controls. It consists of 18, originally 20 key actions called Critical Security Controls, CSC. They are divided into 3 categories: basic, foundational, and organizational. Implementing these controls can help reduce the risk from coding mistakes, weak authentication, insecure design, insecure infrastructure, and other vulnerabilities that attackers use to access sensitive data and systems. Next, the CSA-CCM stands for Cloud Controls Matrix. It's a cybersecurity control framework for cloud computing. It has 197 control objectives that are structured in 17 domains, covering all key aspects of cloud technology. It can be used to assess cloud implementation and select the appropriate security controls for an environment. And finally, if you are in the financial services industry, then leveraging the FFIEC Information Technology Handbook is a must to improve your organization's overall security posture. FFIC stands for Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. Bank examiners use these booklets as guidance to assess the level of security risk to a financial institution's information systems and evaluate the adequacy of the information security program's integration into the overall risk management. Finally, we touch on SAST, DAST, and vulnerability scanning services and capabilities. Here are some open source tools that may be helpful for your organization. The first is Find Security Bugs. It covers OWASP Top 10 and Common Vulnerability Environment, also known as CVE. It can map defects that it finds back to known vulnerabilities. Next, OWASP ZAP, also known as ZAD Attack Proxy. It's an open source dynamic scanner, meaning that it's going to spider a site and try to hack it. It will look for areas where it can input data and try to manipulate the form and hack its way into the application. Next, SQL Map. It's an open source penetration testing tool used to detect SQL injection vulnerabilities. And finally, OpenVAST. It's a vulnerability scanner that can be used to run routine scan on external network. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch it. I hope you find this video helpful. Please subscribe, add your comments, share this video, and give it a thumbs up.